Scott Jensen, and the title of his presentation is Asians, Asian Americans, and Colorism in the Cosmetic Industry.
Kind of tall. That's fine. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Alright, so actually I came up with this title like last night, but the title of this presentation on my capstone, which is titled Asians, Asian Americans, and Colorism in the Cosmetics Industry, is Tall, Light, and Handsome, an exploration of colorism and the conceptualization of beauty among Asian undergraduates at Soka. So in searching for a capstone topic, many thoughts were buzzing through my head. Did I choose the right concentration? Will working within social behavioral sciences allow me to explore in a more humanistic way? Who am I going to choose to be my mentor? All that stuff. I told myself that I was going to think about my capstone topic when I was studying abroad in Taipei, and did I think about it at the time? No, I did not. That didn't happen. But I knew that with my liberal arts education, I would be able to adapt to different modes of thinking and take what I learned from some courses and apply them to others. And much like how I approach writing spoken word poetry, I looked to my experiences for inspiration. That was the impetus for my capstone in this SUA talk, Asians, Asian Americans, and Colorism in the Cosmetics Industry. So I want to give you guys a little timeline of me through the ages. It was the 90s. My family has been in the United States for a little bit, and we were living in San Juan Capistrano, California. We lived in a predominantly lower income neighborhood, with most of my neighbors being immigrants themselves, usually from Mexico or Central America. With my family coming from the Philippines, we bonded over the fact that we had similar colonial histories and religious ties, and all things considered, yes, I was fairly fair-skinned. The year was 2011. I had just returned from a day at the beach with my largely white high school friends when my father makes a comment about my tan. Not a negative comment per se, but a comment nonetheless. The year is 2014. I was enrolled in a Neil Rollins Writing Borderlands 305 class, and I was constructing a final project on transnational families. I created a triptych entitled Kaimanging Skin Puting Minds, Brown Skin White Minds, the Western Feminization Process. During the creation of this triptych, I actually began to tear up because for a split second I had convinced myself that I had become beautiful. That same year, in December, I was strolling the streets of Taipei when I walked into a Korean skincare shop. In Mandarin, I explained to the saleswoman that I was looking for a facial moisturizer that I could use when I returned to the States, when she asks me if I wanted skin whitening. I told her no, and she begins to sample a men's facial moisturizer on the back of my hand, a moisturizer that had skin whitening in it. Cosmetic industries throughout Asia are inundated with skin whitening products. Creams, lotions, serums, acid peels, BB creams, you name it, someone somewhere in Asia probably makes it. It's a reflection of the beauty standards prevalent throughout Asia. Many Asian societies define pale white skin as being more beautiful, pure, and virtuous than tanned or brown skin. This is a product of colorism, which Margaret Hunter defines in a 2007 article as the process of discrimination that privileges light-skinned people of color over their dark-skinned counterparts. These experiences and viewpoints were the driving force behind my capstone, as I set out to interview undergraduate students of Asian descent at Soka. During the months of January and February of this year, I interviewed 8 students and crafted a mixed media ethnographic essay from their responses. Before interviewing the students, I expected a few ideas to be thrown around, such as the influence of colonialism on previously colonized societies, aristocratic social hierarchies, enabling the upper class to spend more time indoors, that sort of thing. But what I ended up finding was a little bit more complex. It wasn't just that students wanted to talk about the effects of colonialism and the hierarchical social stratification of their home countries, but rather every encompassing detail that is characterized by colorism. They discussed the patriarchy and conceptualizations of beauty, globalization and the transfer of ideas, transnationalism and the transfer of social consciousness, microaggressions, macroaggressions, anti-blackness, we discussed it all. So much so that I'm not sure I even scratched the surface of this topic with my 84-page capstone, let alone an 11-minute presentation. I organized my data into 6 main topics: globalization and the export of Western media and ideas, which within also includes neocolonialism, and transnationalism, immigration, and the transfer of social consciousness. I also talked about classism and the tanning question. I talked about patriarchy and the conceptualization of beauty. I talked about microaggressions and macroaggressions. I talked about rhetoric and anti-blackness, as well as brownness as an identity. So the first section, globalization. For Sue Jane, a student who is ethnically Chinese but grew up in Malaysia, she says that the effect of globalization on Malaysian society makes it so that American culture is seen as superior to Malaysian or Chinese culture. She says, I remember in my school, those really Chinese people, we'd be like, oh, you're so uncool, they're like too Chinese. For Erica, who was born and raised in the Philippines, but her family moved to the United States when she was 9, she says that the neo-colonialist attitudes present in the Philippines, which was a former US colony, makes it so that children in the Philippines feel underrepresented in their own country. She says it's scary because if everyone thinks in this way, the way that American culture or America in general is superior to the Philippines, that none of the little girls and boys in the Philippines are going to stand a chance. In regards to transnationalism and the transfer of social consciousness, she also says that although she lost parts of her identity upon emigrating to the United States, the transfer of social consciousness, the ability to begin thinking in different, more diverse ways that run counter to the mainstream Filipino social consciousness was a liberating experience for her. She says it's incredible and that she's excited that there are other ways of thought that she can subscribe to. So for the next section, I'm going to be talking about classism and the tanning question. And the tanning question is a question I get a lot when I tell people about colorism as it affects particularly people of color. And well, the first question that a lot of people have in the United States as well, what about pale white Americans who are pressured to tan? The thing about the tanning question is that it stems from the same source as the desire to have pale skin among groups of color, which is classism. Victoria, who grew up in a largely white neighborhood, says that in her neighborhood swim team, all of her white classmates or all of her white swim mates were jealous of the fact that she could tan very easily. But her Taiwanese mother was very critical of the fact that she could tan very easily. For Erica, who went to a good private school when she was growing up in the Philippines, she says that schoolgirls, mean rich schoolgirls, would question why she was so dark. This idea that skin color and socioeconomic status are inherently intertwined in the Philippines. The next section is on patriarchy and the conceptualization of beauty. Nobuko says that as much as she'd like to deny, that patriarchy has had a really large effect on the way that conceptualizations of beauty and colorism is spread in Japanese society. She says that men typically want whiter girls because a guy can dominate a whiter girl easier than a darker girl. It stems from this idea that darker-skinned women are seen as being more sexually promiscuous or wild or unable to be tamed. Nikki Inamine, whose family is Japanese from Okinawa but grew up in San Jose, she says that being in San Jose, she never dated a white guy before just because it was so racially and ethnically diverse. But in the last summer when she did date a white guy, she just felt like her entire existence was come to question. She was wondering if her short hair made her too masculine to be an Asian girl. She was wondering if her dark skin made her ruined this idea of this kind of like geisha stereotype that Japanese women are expected to fulfill. And this line of thinking is common among not just Western men, but also Asian men. And the next section I want to talk about is micro and macroaggressions. Most of the students that I interviewed kind of talked about their experiences with colorism in microaggressive ways. such as little comments here and there, but a couple students did have some more macro-aggressive ways, or ways in which their experiences with colorism revealed themselves in a much broader sense. So the first person I want to talk about is Alex, who is biracial Japanese and African American, born in Japan, came to the US when he was 4, went back to Japan for middle school and then came back. He says that one thing that his great-grandma told him is that any relationship he gets into will be an interracial relationship. Unless he marries another biracial person who's half black, half Japanese, he says it was very kind of isolating, and in a way it made him feel like he wasn't a whole person. JP, who's Filipino from Filipino Town, says that he didn't realize it at the time, but some of his friends, some family members in Filipino Town would be targeted by police aggression. But it did have an effect on how they viewed Filipino people within Filipino Town, because the police in the area kind of just group all brown people in that area together. Because Filipino Town is in downtown Los Angeles, but there's also a lot of Mexicans and Central Americans. It's right by Echo Park. Yeah. So then the next portion I want to talk about is anti-blackness in regards to rhetoric and colorism. Delali, who is biracial Ghanaian and Japanese, says that growing up, kids at school would be like, "Oh, Delali, you're so dark, you need to lighten up, you're almost black." Like, you don't want to be black, like you still want to look a little kind of Polynesian, right? And she did not understand what that meant whatsoever. For JP, he says that in the Filipino community, in Filipino Town, anti-blackness is apparent in how darker-skinned Filipino people are treated. They would bag on darker-skinned Filipinos and ask them microaggressive comments like, "Why are you so black?" And then this last concept that I talk about was mentioned by a few students using different terminology, but kind of the same idea of using this idea of brown or brown skin as a form of identity and as a way to kind of raise your own self-confidence in regards to how you view your identity and in regards to how you view other people within your racial or ethnic group. Nobuko says that when she's brown, when she's going to the beach every day with friends, she feels more like herself. But during the winter, especially in Japan, when she isn't tan and she's trying to look good like my peers, and good in this sense is subscribing to and conforming to Japanese conventions of beauty, she was always worried about everything and didn't have any confidence. Erica says that she isn't ashamed of her color now. She loves being brown, but maybe when she was younger, she thought about getting skin whitening. When I was talking to Erica during our interview, she says that growing up in the Philippines, her mom would get weekly skin lightening treatments at dermatologists, or at a dermatologist's office, and that is exceedingly common in the Philippines. So when she witnessed her mom doing that, her mom would often say, "Oh, when you turn 18, we can do the same thing for you." This kind of thinking is also prevalent in plastic surgery, encouraging young Filipino people to get like nose surgeries, rhinoplasty, or just to use makeup to like contour the nose to make it look slimmer. The word that Erica uses is matangos, which in Tagalog means like pointed, because in the Philippines noses are kind of like more flat. So in conclusion, ultimately my main goal was to highlight the individual voices and experiences of Asian undergraduates at Soka. I wanted to not only discuss colorism and Asian standards of beauty via the cosmetics industry, but I wanted to prioritize the words and viewpoints of the students themselves, particularly on how it affected their self-image or how they view themselves. In discussing these concepts at length, I have begun to unpack the complexities of colorism as it affects the cosmetics industry, and I hope that I get to encourage other Asian students to love the skin that they're in, despite what their respective cultural contexts might say. Any questions? That's not a question, but thank you. Okay.
You mentioned in your presentation that there was a moment where you were emotional because the person
Yeah.
was beautiful.
Yeah.
Has writing your capstone just your entire
Mhm.
your life? has that transformed, or is it still a work in progress? Or?
Well, I would never say that I've gotten to a point where I'm fully confident in how I view myself in regards to skin color or otherwise. It will always be a process, but I feel like since that point, I have made a lot of strides. I think just being in the Philippines itself was such a test for me, because it was actually also the first time I'd ever been to the Philippines, was after study abroad. And I was there for 5 weeks, so it wasn't like I could just like, oh, I get to leave in a few days. So yeah, sorry. I would say that it has gotten a lot better, but at this point in time, I cannot tell if that is because I myself am fairer than I was before, or if that's because I feel like I've begun to familiarize myself with these concepts more. I feel like it might be a little bit of both. It's weird. In regards to skin color, and I talk about it a lot in my capstone, the varying levels of privilege that I experienced in the Philippines was contingent upon how my skin color was in comparison to other people. So I talk about how my mother's family comes from a less affluent background than my father's, and so they're typically darker skinned. And so when I was spending time with my mother's family, they would often talk about how fair I was. And obviously it was usually with like a positive light. Whereas when I spent time with my father's family, he was much more affluent and much fairer skins, presumably due to the assumption that they have the money to afford, skin lightening treatments, that kind of thing. They would often talk about how I looked so much like my mom, which I can only take in so many ways. So it's a little bit of that. I feel like I answered that. Yeah, I was just gonna reiterate what I already said, but yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? No? Cool, thank you.